The Cinnamon Beare by Angelee Sailer Anderson. Read by Stanley Anderson. In the olden golden days of beardom, when honeypots were fuller and sweeter than now, and brightest of all the constellations shone the Ursas major and minor, there was born into a noble house a red-brown bear. The bear lord and bear lady that were his father and mother christened him Cinnamon, not only because that is the color his fur was, but because it was a tradition in those days to name one's cubs after spices and herbs. Some say this tradition was due to spices being rare and precious, and others say it was because bears spend most of their thinking time thinking of food. Whatever the truth of it, no parent would have dreamed of naming his cub Theodore, which is the real name of all teddies, though they seldom admit it. No, but in the golden days, bears had names like Caraway and Marjoram and Sesame, and most popular of all, Cinnamon, the name of our hero, to whom we will now return. Cinnamon was trained from his cubhood to be a knight. He learned jousting and archery and falconry and heraldry and the most expeditious way of mounting a horse and the precise requirements for a proper suit of armor, and how to chivalrously court a bear lady. He studied hard in the bear bestiaries to learn the strengths and weaknesses of the sundry monsters he, as a knight, might be expected to battle. He learned that dragons are not ticklish except on their underbellies, that one should wear earplugs when pulling up a mandrake root, and that one must never, under any circumstances, look a basilisk in the eye. When Cinnamon had reached the proper age, and had proved his mettle by serving first as a page and then an excellent squire to an old bear named Sir Tarragon, he was ready to become a sir in his own right. He equipped himself with a suit of armor of dazzling brightness, a sturdy shield, golden spurs, and a well-tempered sword, which he named Honeyseeker. He chose this device for his coat of arms: argent, a bear rampant, jewels towering over a honey-pot. Then, having been duly dubbed Sir Cinnamon by Sage, the Bear King, our hero settled down to a life at court. He settled a bit too immovably. Now that he had demonstrated his worthiness by becoming a genuine knight, Sir Cin felt that he had had quite enough of daring-doing and dragon-dashing and rescuing distressed damsels. I hope you will not think too harshly of him when I tell you that he now fought all his dragons by proxy. And what did Sir Cinnamon do instead of riding out upon quests and adventures? He did what a bear, knightly or otherwise, does best. He ate, and ate. He breakfasted on scones buttered with the ground bones of camelopards. For dinner he had bannocks baked with, of course, honey. And supper time it was peacock pie with peppercorns and mango chutney, chased down by a full barrel of Rhenish wine. Sir Cin's dessert consisted of 1 tub of syllabub, a second of gooseberry fool, and a third of trifle made with a 10-pound jar of raspberry jam. I won't embarrass you by mentioning what the bear had for snacks, except that his favorite was toast sprinkled with heaps of, yes, cinnamon. The end result was that Sir Cinnamon grew rather weighty. His belly grew more plump than was pleasing, and his red-brown fur became thick and matted. No one at court remarked on this, because it is an infirmity to which bears in general are prone. Yet bears do have their pride, and respectable ones draw the line at 7 snacks a day, besides the regular 5 meals and 3 desserts. Sir Cinnamon had degenerated to 20 snacks a day, almost 3 times the decent number. And so finally somebody did remark on it, and that somebody was the king. One midsummer's evening the king hosted a scrumptious feast in his castle's great hall, and knights courageous, and ladies lovely, and jolly jesters, and merry minstrels from all over beardom came together for it. The feast itself defies description. There were 103 courses. So I shall go on at once to telling you what happened after supper. The bear knights, Sirs Chervil, Coriander, Nutmeg, Parsley, Saffron, and Turmeric, to name a few, were sitting around the board with their drinking horns of mead, and the ladies were flirting, and the jesters were gesturing, and the king was presiding sagely over all. The company was listening to a bear minstrel who sang of those heroes so admired by knights in the golden days. Heroes like Beowulf and Sir Galabert and King Richard the Bear-hearted. The minstrel had just finished an especially exciting lay about Beowulf's battle with the monster Grendel, and King Sage and his knights were clapping wildly and enthusiastically. The good, strong, slap-slapping sound of all those paws hardened by chivalrous deeds was noble and inspiring. But gradually, one by one, the company noticed a sound of quite a different sort amid the slapping. As nearly as one could describe it, it was something like poof, poof. One by one the knights quit clapping, and last of all the king quit clapping, till the mysterious poofing was the only sound to be heard in the hall. and now it became apparent from where the sound was coming. It was Sir Cinnamon. His paws were so well padded and so very plush with red-brown fur that when he clapped he did not make a slap-slap sound, but a flabby, fluffy, cutesy, cuddly sound like that made by the paws of today's under-adventurous teddies. "Poof, poof," said Sir Cinnamon's clap. "Poof, poof," went his paws. "Poof, poof." Sir Cinnamon stopped in mid-clap. The hall had become absolutely silent, and all the knights were looking at him, and worse yet, the king. And worse yet, Lady Rosemary. Lady Rosemary, Sir Cinnamon's true love, the she-bear so beauteous in her Lincoln green kirtle, and her wimple fairly framing her golden-furred face. Lady Rosemary was the first to break the silence. She broke it in a most humiliating, to Sir Cinnamon, way. She giggled. Sir Cinnamon hung his shaggy head in shame. The other knights felt sorry for him and politely looked elsewhere, but King Sage, who was an elderly bear and a trifle deaf, had not heard the giggle. And so, with the very best intentions, he said something which made Sir Cinnamon's red-brown fur turn more red than brown. The Bear King cleared his throat. "Sir Cinnamon," quoth he, "as thou knowest, we are rather hard of hearing, and thusly we may be mistaken. But did we or did we not hear thee say, or rather hear thy paws say, poof, poof?" "I fear, sire," replied Sir Cinnamon dolefully, "that thy hearing hath not deceived thee." "Sir Cinnamon," said the kind old king, as tactfully as he could, "hast thou taken thought of late of perchance going on some quest, an enterprise for exercise? They say the Barrisons want battling in Jerusalem, and there is a crusade afoot to prevent Baroness from sinking into the sea. You might pay a visit to our brother king in Camberlot. Byzantium is very nice this time of year." The king's voice trailed off. He was sure that Sir Cinnamon had got the general drift of his speech. "It seems to us," he ended apologetically, "we believe we are correct in feeling that poof, poof, coming forth from a bear's paws is a sound not quite knightly." Sir Cinnamon lifted his eyes to meet the king's. There was the beginnings of a tear in one of them. He could feel Lady Rosemary noticing how voluminous was the waistline of his surcoat. He himself remembered that when he had last put on his armor, his overgrown fur had stuck out from between the plates and made him look like a mattress losing its stuffing. "I will go on a quest, sire," began Sir Cin with a depressed sigh. Then he decided for the sake of his honor and his lady to put on a cheerful countenance. He smiled so widely that all his teeth showed, which in a bear has a rather ghastly effect. "Surely there is some unfortunate soul abroad whose pet hippogriff has got out of hand, or some bourgeois bears from whom one might justifiably steal to give to the poor, or some foul worm who has been making his midnight meal on damsels. By the great and lesser bears of heaven," Sir Cinnamon growled with forced fierceness as he unsheathed his sword, "whatever evildoer I encounter, his evil deeds I will put to an end." The knight returned his blade to its scabbard with a bold flourish, but what he was thinking was, maybe, hopefully, the dragons are out of shape too. So Sir Cinnamon polished his armor and squeezed himself into it, donned a new sword belt into which Lady Rosemary had woven some of her fur, and gathered together his yew bow and his lance and his dirk and his shield and his gauntlets and his golden spurs. Nor did he forget to sharpen Honeyseeker until it could accurately pinpoint a freckle on a bumblebee's stinger. He put on his helmet with its phoenix feather plume, mounted his good steed Oregano, and turned back toward the castle to wave a sad farewell to Lady Rosemary. The lady leaned out from the turret window and tossed him a honeycomb. Sir Cinnamon caught it between his teeth. For a year and a day Sir Cinnamon wandered from border to border of beardom, and to places beyond. He jousted in 90 tournaments, and after the shock to his system of the first one, won them all. He slew 27 dragons, 15 amphisbaenas, and 3 sorceresses, in whose invisible dungeons many knights errant were kept prisoner. He saved a paladin of the great Emperor Berlamain from death at the hands of the infidel, and fought by the side of the Spanish knight Elbert. With the booty he gained from the wars and tournaments, he relieved 114 poor widows and hermits. Throughout all his wanderings he concealed his true identity, but from the device blazoned on his shield and surcoat he was known as the Red Bear Knight. On the final day of the year and a day, a much thinner Cinnamon was riding upon a much thinner Oregano on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. One would expect Sir Cinnamon to be in triumphant spirits over his accomplishments, especially on a fine summer day with all the peonies in bloom. But in fact he was extremely disconsolate. For though in bear flesh he was a mere sliver of his former self, in bear fur he was still fluffier than a bear has a right to be. Sir Cinnamon was especially unhappy at this particular moment because he had just tried a discouraging experiment. He had known what the results of it would be before he tried it, because he had tried it last only 15 minutes ago. But just in case, he had made the experiment anyway. He had clapped together his paws. Poof, poof, they had mocked him. I shall never go back to court, never behold my Lady Rosemary again. I am no knight. I am a poof bear, moaned Sir Sin. As if to add an exclamation mark to his misery, an impudent bee lighted on his nose, and no amount of flailing with honey-seeker would shoo it off. What seekest thou here, bee? Grumbled Sir Cinnamon. This nose has not been dipped in honey for a year. Wouldst thou like to know what I had for breakfast this morning? A brambleberry. One berry. He tightened the sword belt made by Lady Rosemary, which by now wrapped around him 4 times. Sir Cinnamon was just preparing to quench his thirst with an eyedropper full of water when he heard the sound of scufflings punctuated by feminine screams coming from a nearby wood. "A lady in need of a knight," he cried, and spurred Oregano in the direction of the sound. Leaving trampled undergrowth and broken branches in their wake, the bear and his mount charged through the trees into a clearing. There in the clearing's center was a most dastardly and villainous knight, Sir Mace, who never dared to show his face at court. And there, in Sir Mace's brutal clutches, was his own sweet Rosemary. Sir Cinnamon felt the bear blood boil within him. "Hola!" he commanded Oregano. The horse skidded to a halt. Sir Sin gazed haughtily and contemptuously upon Sir Mace, and disguising his voice so that Lady Rosemary would not know him, spoke in as unmannerly a manner as the code of chivalry would allow. "Thou, Sir Knight, what doest thou there with that young damsel?" Sir Mace, a huge black grizzly, grinned wickedly. "What I do with her is none of thy concern." Rosemary looked up at Sir Cinnamon with tear-filled, pleading eyes. He was so changed from the roly-poly bear she remembered that, even without his helmet on, she would not have recognized him. She broke Sir Mace's hold enough to fall on one knee. "Oh, please, please, gentle knight, deliver me from this vile villain ere he bring upon me some shameful dishonor." "Fear not, lady," answered Sir Cinnamon, with his eyes aflame. "The Red Bear Knight will be thy champion." He drew Honey-Seeker from its scabbard and pointed it menacingly and meaningfully at Sir Mace. "Yield, recreant, unhand the maiden." "By the muzzle of the great bear and by his tail I will not," pouted Sir Mace. "Ha, knave!" shouted Sir Sin. "Dost dare to defy me? Begone, caitiff, churl! Get thee gone, I say, else thou wilt feel the point of my blade within thy furry throat." Diminished as Sir Cinnamon was in size, his aura of knightly power was grown to impressive proportions. The threat was too much for Sir Mace. He let loose of Lady Rosemary, and stopping every few steps to snarl back at Sir Cinnamon, he shuffled away. Lady Rosemary rose to her hind paws and batted her eyelashes at Sir Cinnamon. "Oh, thank you, brave, brave knight," she cooed, her voice as sweet as a hive drip-dropping honey. "Thou hast saved me from a fate worse than death." "Think not on it, lady," replied Sir Cinnamon, modestly. "I have vowed to uphold the code of chivalry, and whilst I live, so ever shall I do." He sheathed Honey-Seeker, then took Lady Rosemary's extended forepaw in his and kissed it gently. "Adieu, fair damsel, the great bear shield thee. When thou art at thy prayers, remember the Red Bear Knight." Sir Cinnamon turned Oregano's head around and prepared to ride onward, leaving Lady Rosemary behind him, never to be seen again. "Farewell, Rosemary," he whispered, his voice choking so that it was no longer disguised. Just as Oregano was about to break into a gallop, Lady Rosemary caught hold of the horse's bridle rein. "Cinnamon, my gallant, valiant bear, thou hast returned to me," and lovely Rosemary began to weep. Sir Cinnamon tried clumsily to comfort her, but he knew that there was something distressing he must tell her. "Lady Rosemary, do not weep for me. Spare thy tears for another bear worthy of thee. It is true that in the last year and a day I have jousted in 90 tournaments, and after the shock to my system of the first one, won them all. It is sooth that I have slain 27 dragons, 15 amphisbaenas, and 3 sorceresses in whose invisible dungeons many knights errant were kept prisoner. I will not deny that I have saved a paladin of the great Emperor Berlamain from death at the hands of the infidel. But it is nothing that with the booty I gained from the wars and tournaments I have relieved 114 poor widows and hermits. All has been in vain. For listen, Lady Rosemary, listen." And ever so mournfully Sir Sin clapped his poofing paws together. Lady Rosemary took the paws in hers and gazed on him with adoring eyes. "Silly Cinnamon, I care not about thy paws. Thou art my true love, my own knight, forever." Sir Cinnamon helped Rosemary up onto Oregano behind him. The horse was so exhausted from undernourishment and excessive weight that it could barely bear another bear's weight. "Cinnamon," said Lady Rosemary as they continued on their way to Canterbury, "I am sorry that I giggled at the feast." "But, Sir Cinnamon," she said, stifling another giggle, "there is a bee on thy nose." With a paw-nail as sharp as Honeyseeker she flicked the bee off. So it was that after returning to court from their pilgrimage, Sir Cinnamon and Lady Rosemary were wed. King Sage hosted the grandest, most joyful celebration in the history of beardom, with enough cates and dainties and wassail to refatten Sir Cinnamon to his former girth, if Lady Rosemary had not kept one loving blue eye on him. Cinnamon could hardly take his eyes from Rosemary. She was so fair in her mulberry dress and her new leather buskins. Yet out of courtesy and perhaps a bit of pride, he turned to give his attention to the bear minstrel who was busy singing of Sir Cinnamon's exploits in the past year and a day. The minstrel ended, and all the knights waited to hear Sir Cinnamon clap first. "Poof, poof!" clapped Sir Cinnamon proudly, and the knights laughed and clapped, and the king laughed and clapped, and Lady Rosemary laughed and clapped, and Sir Cinnamon laughed too. Sir Cinnamon laughed and could not stop laughing, but this did not prevent him from stuffing another barbecued dragon rib into his mouth. He cast a guilty eye upon his lady. "My Cinnamon Beare," whispered Lady Rosemary, and smothered his laughter and his appetite with a kiss. End.